Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is a remake of Lesson 30. Today I'm going to show you how to eat crow because I made a mistake on my first version of this video when I did my yarn over. So, we're going to redo it and I'll show you the right way to do the yarn over. So, this is called diagonal stitch, and the one I'm wearing is the pattern I'm going to be showing you, and that is Twirling Cowl. This is a free pattern by Joanne Fabric and Craft, and it was designed for the Cobbles yarn, which is what I made it in, and that's the Patons gathered fiber yarn, which comes in a lot of colors. It's beautiful to work with, but they're small skeins. There's only 41 yards on a skein. And to make this scarf, I reduced the stitch number, and I got away with 2 skeins. Buy 3 just in case. You may only need 2. So if you can see on the table, and Joe maybe wants to do a close-up here, this will let me demonstrate a couple things about this. The one on this side, I'm actually doing on knitting needles with 1 strand of a number 5 yarn, Serenity yarn, and I put on 48 stitches on my 29-inch circular needles. And this one on the table came out too short. The skeins were too short. They were only 64 yard skeins. So you'll need, at least 80 yards to do this pattern if you do it as I did. So this is only 9 inches deep, and the one I'm wearing is 12. So if you want a little more fullness to it, you're going to have to make sure you have enough yarn. But I only put on 36 stitches when I did it on the 24-inch knitting hoop. So when you're working with finer yarn, this was a question that I was emailed this week. When you're working with finer yarn, you want to make sure you're using something smaller, like your US 15 rod, or if you want to totally change the look, they're both done the same way. The only difference is this is on circular needles, and you'll notice that my diagonal moves from left to right uphill. And when I do it on the knitting rods, this is my cast on edge, it moves from right to left, and that's because everything gets reversed, which was my mistake when I did the yarn over in this last lesson. So you can see that you can get a totally different look simply by changing your stitch size, by changing the size of the knitting rod, or using heavier yarn, or this is done with 2 strands of a number 6 bulky. And that's kind of a neat rustic look. Just make sure you have enough yarn when you start. So again, this pattern was a free pattern, and it called for US 19 needles, 29 inches long, and casting on 42 stitches, and I did not like it that way. So I ended up doing it on the US 17, and it is about 12 inches wide this way, or 12 inches wide this way, deep, and 28 inches around. And there is a back to this. I think it's easier to see on this. This is where you change your rows, but, that's very subtle. I don't think you're really going to notice that in the pattern. So, let's move on now, and I will show you how to get started on this. The pattern is simple, but it changes every row. So we're going to change the camera angle and get started. Alright, so first of all, to get started, you need to cast on, and if you want to minimize the knots, remember that little trick I showed you in a previous video. So if this is my tail in my left hand, and I just fold the yarn over, and I leave enough, obviously, have enough yarn out here for your tail, and take that top part of the loop and twist it once, twist it once counterclockwise, and twist it again. So now, twist it and twist it. Now you have a little loop that's twisted twice, and hold it with your fingers, and put it on your knitting hoop. Put your fingers through here, and now you can begin a slingshot cast on. Like so. And that's exactly what I did here. And you notice that that minimizes. There's no knot now. And that will look a little better you know, at the end. That way the neck of the cowl, no matter where it's positioned, you know, you minimize the knots at the edge. And you'll see in lesson 32, I show you a way of crossing over the stitches when you join it in the round. And frankly, I'm not crazy about that method. I think it's just as easy for you to do as I demonstrated when you did the hats, which is just taking your stitches after you've cast on and turning them so that your yarns are on the right side, turning your ridge to the inside, put it down in your, you know, little holder in this case, and take both your tail and your working yarn. So in this case you have 2 strands. If you, because I'm only using 1 strand of yarn as my working yarn, so now you have to take both of those strands, take off your first stitch, and if the direction is to knit 1, now use both of those strands together and make your first stitch, you see, with both yarns. Don't forget then, when you begin row 2, that you actually have doubled this. So if you were working with 2 strands of a working yarn, you would actually see 4 yarns here that form that first stitch. And don't forget that. And before you actually make that stitch onto there for row 1, don't forget to put on your little stitch marker so that you know, because that is your first stitch of row 1. And that's how I think it looks better. Just do that on the first stitch. Some people say to do the first 2 stitches, but I was satisfied by just using 1. In fact, I think on that single strand with circular needles I might have used on the first 2 stitches. I used both yarns. But then when you're done with that, take your tail back through and be done with it. So I think that's a better way of starting out your first round. Now, the first thing I would advise when you're doing this pattern, because I messed this up a number of times, every single row changes, and you are going to be doing a set of, it's 5 rounds, 5 different rounds. In each round, the stitches change. So you can see that I wrote this out for myself in big writing so that I could see it easily. And I put a highlighter on round 3, the last stitch, where the yarn over is. And it's very easy to forget this because it's the very last motion you make in that round. And if you don't do it, you're going to be goobered up on the next row. So, take my advice and rewrite your thing. Or, you know, if you can read something that small, go ahead and but highlight it or circle it or something so that you know. And once you've knit for considerable time, it'll begin looking like this. Now, in this case, I'm still using, if you have a set you bought from me, that's the purple. That's the size equivalent to US 17 needle, and it's 24 inches long, and I'm using 2 strands of big twist yarn, and I'll have more than enough. I'm nearly done. So I've already done, you can see my stitch counter, I've done 4 sets of those 5 rounds. And so that's not row 45. I just know that's the 4th set. I just finished the 5th round, and now I'm going to begin another round 1. So I'll click this up to the 5, and I'll reset this to 1. And I know now this is my 5th set of round 1. And the original pattern, it called for doing it 5 times till it was 12 and a half inches deep. If you are knitting and it's deep enough, you can end it at any time, and then you cast off knitwise. But let's just show now how to do the actual yarn over, and we're going to knit some of these sequences. So you can put on, again, as I said earlier, any number of stitches you want, but it has to be a multiple of 6 because that's what's in the pattern. So once you have some body onto this, by the way, it's going to get heavy if you just hold it between your legs like that. Sometimes I just take the scarf itself and I'm grabbing that and letting the hoop sit on top of my legs. And here was my stitch marker. I just used yarn so it would fit on there. And now I'm going to begin round 1. And the first thing it says to do is knit 2. So make sure your stitches are around there. and take both of your strands and knit one, knit two, now yarn over, and you do just what you do in lesson 32 when you're doing the brioche on the hoop. Bring your yarn through and around, and it says to knit two together. Now, because of how the yarn over works on this pattern, it's easier if you actually take them off one at a time. So take off the first one and it will look like a real stitch. Put it over your working yarns, pull your working yarns up, then I take my left hand fingers and I put it through that loop. This is the new stitch. Take off the next one. This is the yarn over, and it's just going to look like this. It won't look like a true stitch. Lay that over the working yarns. Grab the working yarns. This is your new stitch. Lay it face down, if you will, onto the right side. Now knit one, or front stitch one. Now take the yarn back through to the back. You're going to back stitch one, or purl one, according to the pattern. You're going to make that stitch, pipe it, and bring the yarn back to the front. That's your sequence of 6, and you're going to continue around for round 1. Knit 2, yarn over by bringing the yarn through and around clockwise. If you were doing this on knitting needles, it would be the opposite. So now you knit 2 together. So take off the first stitch, lay it over your working yarn, bring your working yarn or yarns through, put your fingers from your left hand in there. You can hold the working yarn across those strands if you want, through your palm. Then take off the next one, which is the yarn over, and put it over there. That's your new stitch. So you'll have 4 strands of yarn around that new stitch. Pipe it, knit 1, bring your yarn back through the middle. You're going to back stitch or purl 1. Bring your yarn back to the front. And again, the sequence simply repeats. Knit 2, yarn over. So bring your yarn through and around clockwise. Knit 2 together. This will be a stitch, and it will be the yarn over from the previous row. It'll look just like this. You'll say to yourself, that can't be right. But it is. And that's what creates the holes in the fabric. Knit 1, purl 1, back stitch 1. And you will continue around till you get to the end of the row. And you'll see that with each row, that sequence changes. So that's what makes this a little tricky. Keep going, and when we get to the end of round 3, I'll tell you what to do. So now I've been knitting on my round 3. I'm almost finished. I have 12 stitches left. The last thing I did was a yarn over. And again, that was just simply moving the yarn between the tips of the knitting hoop and bringing it around clockwise, if you will. And we'll knit 2 together. And again, with this sequence, it was easier to take them off one at a time. You'll see in lesson 32, I take them both off at the same time. But it'll depend on when you make the yarn over as to what's easier to do. And that's my stitch. And I pipe it. Then the next thing I do is a knit 1. Bring your yarn back through to purl 1 or back stitch 1. Bring the yarn back through and front stitch 2 or knit 2. You notice that I'm not pulling these very tightly. If you do, you're going to have the last thing is a yarn over. And again, may I suggest putting a highlighter or something on there. It's really easy to forget because you're going to feel like, well, you're not really knitting. But I want to point something out here. You're going to get lost as you're doing this pattern if you're anything like me. Go ahead and bring your yarn back through there so you know what you're doing. Now, spread these out. And if you do, if you're lost and you're not sure where you were at and what you just did, this is what your yarn over is going to look like on the knitting rod. And if you look to the next stitch, you know I have 4 strands of yarn around that stitch. That was a knit 2 together. Next I knitted 1, purled 1, then I knit 2, and here's my yarn over. So get used to, familiarize yourself with what that looks like. So when you're lost, you can just count back and see what you did last. So that's my yarn over, and I should have 6 stitches left, and my sequence repeats, knit 2 together, and again. On this diagonal stitch with where the yarn over falls, it was easier for me to take off one at a time, put over the working yarn, pull your working yarn up. You should see your 4 strands of yarn through there. Pipe it. Front stitch 1 or knit 1. Back stitch 1 or purl 1. Bring your yarn back forward. Let me kind of pitch this forward a little bit. Is that better? And now the last thing you do on this, make sure your stitches are around there, is knit 2. But don't forget the yarn over before you begin round 4. Bring your yarn through and clockwise and take your stitch marker off and put it on. And now you're ready to begin yarn 4. Now, or round 4. Now, I'm almost finished. This is supposed to measure 12.5 inches, and I'm pretty much there now. I have about 14.5 yards of yarn left, I believe. In fact, this is a little bit longer already than 12 inches. So I could stop at this point and cast off. It doesn't matter if it's the length you want or you're out of yarn. Just make sure you've left enough for your cast off row. And I want to show you something. It's a mistake I make all the time, and I don't know where I got the idea to make this knot. So here's our little sample piece. And I've begun casting off, and you can see I've only got 4 stitches left. And as I've worked around, here's the side I'm knitting onto, and I've only have this many. Now, I put it down in there. And I'm casting off, you'll do the same thing when you make the diagonal twirling cowl. You'll just cast off knitwise. And as you cast off on this, you're bringing one off. You'll do it just like, in fact, if you look at lesson 32, I go through the whole cast off. So you can look ahead to that and just keep putting one on, pulling one over. I made these a little too tight. It's not the cast off that's important. The last stitch is the one that I have a funny habit. I don't know where I got that. I'll show you here in a second. So now you've cast off. You have 1 stitch remaining. Now, somehow or other, I always got the idea, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this so I can show you what I mean. Here's your last stitch, and I've gone ahead and cut my yarn. Somewhere along the line, I got the idea I had to pull this yarn back through here and pull it tight. And you end up with a knot. And that's not right. I was watching a video the other day, and she just went like this. And I thought, where in the world did I get the idea that was going to come off? And that looks much nicer. And now you can take your tail and go back to your beginning and weave it through just like I do at the end of lesson 32. And I'm not going to go over that now because I did that in, again, I do it in lesson 32. But just so you know, you can just pull that through. Don't bring it back again or you're going to wind up with a knot there and you won't like that. And when you're finished, you will wind up with a, again, diagonal pattern. And there's really, it's very difficult to tell where that ends and, you know, each row begins and ends, but it is not reversible. This is your inside. So you can take your yarn now through and weave it into the piece. Don't leave a knot up along your edge because that will show. And you'll be all done. Enjoy your new scarf. Thanks for watching.